This is completely unacceptable. William Chen's voice carried across the quiet suburban street as he gestured angrily at the overgrown yard next door. Property values are dropping because of this mess. The elderly man sitting on the porch in his wheelchair said nothing, just watched with tired eyes as his neighbor ranted about weeds and regulations. But what Chen didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez couldn't tend his yard. Not because he was lazy, but because he'd lost both legs stepping on a landmine while carrying wounded Marines to safety in Maple Street in Phoenix, Arizona was the kind of neighborhood where perfection was expected, not earned. Cookie-cutter houses built in the late 1980s sat in precise rows, each with their regulation front yard, driveway, and carefully maintained landscape. The Homeowners Association ruled with an iron fist, enforcing standards that kept property values high and individuality low. It was a place where conformity was comfort, where deviation from the norm was seen as a personal affront to everyone who'd invested their life savings in suburban paradise. William Chen had moved to Maple Street 15 years ago with his wife Margaret, drawn by the promise of a quiet retirement in a neighborhood that maintained its standards. At 68, Chen was a man who measured his worth by the precision of his hedge trimming and the emerald perfection of his Augustine grass. His garage housed a collection of lawn equipment that rivaled most landscaping companies, and his weekends were spent in the meditative pursuit of horticultural perfection. The house next door at 2047 Maple Street was Chen's personal nightmare. What had once been a modest but well-maintained yard had, over the past 5 years, slowly devolved into what Chen considered an eyesore. The grass grew in uneven patches, weeds choked the flower beds, and the small palm tree in the front yard leaned at an angle that suggested neglect rather than character. To Chen, it represented everything wrong with people who didn't take pride in their property, who didn't understand that neighborhood standards were everyone's responsibility. What Chen didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was the story of the man who owned that house. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez had bought 127 Maple Street in 1985, 2 years after his medical discharge from the Marine Corps. The VA loan had made homeownership possible, and the single-story ranch house with its small front yard had seemed perfect for a man learning to navigate the world on prosthetic legs. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors seemed friendly, and Tommy had dreams of creating a small garden where he could find peace after the chaos of war and recovery. For years, Tommy had maintained his yard with the same precision he'd once brought to military duties. He'd learned to operate a riding mower despite his prosthetics, had planted drought-resistant flowers that bloomed in Arizona's harsh climate, and had taken pride in contributing to the neighborhood's aesthetic standard. But time, age, and the cumulative effect of multiple surgeries had gradually made outdoor work impossible. The prosthetics that had once felt like a manageable inconvenience now caused constant pain. Infection sites that never fully healed made wearing the artificial limbs agony for more than short periods. The Arizona heat, which he'd never minded as a young man, now became dangerous for someone whose circulation had been compromised by decades of medical complications. And the phantom pain, the sensation that his missing legs were still there, still being crushed by the landmine that had changed his life, made concentration difficult on even the best days. Tommy's wife Maria had helped maintain the yard until her death from cancer 3 years ago. After her funeral, Tommy had tried to hire landscaping services, but his fixed income barely covered medical expenses and basic living costs. The yard began its slow decline, each passing month adding to Chen's growing frustration. On this particular Saturday morning in March, Chen had reached his breaking point. The spring growing season had begun, and while his own yard showcased the precise emergence of new growth, the Rodriguez property looked worse than ever. Chen stormed across the street, clipboard in hand, ready to deliver an ultimatum that he was sure would finally motivate his lazy neighbor to take action. Tommy sat on his covered porch, a position that had become his daily routine since mobility became too challenging for regular outings. He watched Chen approach with a familiar sense of dread, knowing that the conversation would follow a pattern that had become increasingly hostile over the past year. "Mr. Rodriguez," Chen began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This situation has gone on long enough. Look at this mess." He gestured broadly at the front yard, his clipboard serving as a pointer for each transgression. "The grass is 3 inches over HOA regulations. There are weeds growing through the walkway, and that tree needs to be either staked properly or removed entirely." Tommy adjusted his position in the wheelchair, a movement that sent shooting pain up his spine where shrapnel from the same explosion that took his legs remained embedded. "I know it's not ideal, Mr. Chen," he said quietly. "I'm working on finding someone who can help." "Working on it?" Chen's voice rose an octave. "You've been working on it for 2 years. This isn't a charity case, neighborhood Rodriguez. We all have standards to maintain, and your property is dragging down everyone's investment." The word charity hit Tommy like a physical blow. He'd spent his adult life serving his country, had sacrificed his legs for men he'd never met, had paid taxes on this property for nearly 40 years. But to his neighbor, he was nothing more than a burden on property values. "I understand your concerns," Tommy replied, fighting to keep his voice level. "But I'm dealing with some health issues that make yard work challenging." Chen scoffed. "Health issues? You're not the only senior citizen in this neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson is 82 and her yard is immaculate. Mr. Kim just had heart surgery, and he's still out there every weekend with his edger." Tommy felt the familiar surge of anger that he'd learned to suppress over decades of dealing with civilians who couldn't understand what some health issues actually meant. How could he explain that his health issues included phantom limb syndrome that made him feel like his missing legs were being crushed by a landmine every time he tried to sleep? How could he describe the infections that required constant medical attention, the surgeries that had become annual events, the way his prosthetics had rubbed his stumps raw to the point where wearing them was torture? "I'm doing the best I can," Tommy said finally. "Well, your best isn't good enough," Chen shot back. "I filed a formal complaint with the HOA, and if this doesn't get fixed within 30 days, they'll fine you and hire contractors to do the work at your expense. Maybe that will motivate you to take some pride in your property." Chen turned to leave, then paused and delivered what he clearly thought was a crushing final argument. "You know, this used to be a neighborhood where people cared about their community, where people took responsibility. I don't know what happened to your generation's work ethic, but some of us still believe in maintaining standards." The accusation about work ethic hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Tommy Rodriguez, who had worked construction for 20 years after his military service, who had never missed a mortgage payment, who had maintained this same property for decades before his body finally betrayed him, felt something break inside his chest. But he didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the enemy didn't even know there was a war going on. Chen stalked back to his perfectly manicured property, satisfied that he'd finally taken action. He didn't notice the small American flag that sat in a holder beside Tommy's front door, faded from years of Arizona sun. He didn't see the Purple Heart license plate on the modified van in the driveway. He certainly didn't notice the way Tommy's hands trembled as he wheeled himself back into the house, or the tears that the old Marine wiped away before anyone could see them. What Chen also didn't know was that Tommy Rodriguez wasn't as isolated as he appeared. The VA had connected him with other veterans in the area, and the local VFW post still considered him family, even though he rarely attended meetings anymore. Most importantly, Tommy maintained contact with his old unit, the Marines he'd served with in Vietnam, scattered across the country, but still bound by experiences that civilians could never understand. That evening, Tommy called his old squad leader, now retired Master Sergeant Iron Mike Johnson, living in Tucson. They talked every few weeks, checking in on each other's health, sharing memories of better times, and providing the kind of support that only came from shared understanding. "Mike," Tommy said after their usual pleasantries, "I need some advice. I'm having trouble with a neighbor, and I'm not sure how to handle it." Tommy described the confrontation, the HOA complaint, and the impossible choice between bankruptcy from contractor fees or violation penalty. He didn't ask for help. Tommy Rodriguez had never asked for help, not even when he was learning to walk again in a VA hospital. He just needed someone to understand why a patch of overgrown grass could feel like such a devastating defeat. Mike listened without interruption, recognizing the pain in his old Marine's voice. When Tommy finished, Mike was quiet for a long moment. "Tommy," he said finally, "do you remember Corporal Jenkins from 2nd Squad?" "Of course. Good kid from Alabama. Took shrapnel in the arm during the Tet Offensive. He's living in Phoenix now. Retired from the post office a few years ago." "And Rodriguez?" "Yeah, he's got a lawn service. Employs a bunch of vets who needed work. Maybe it's time we reminded your neighborhood what community service really looks like." The conversation continued for another hour, two old Marines planning an operation with the same careful attention to detail they'd once used to plan patrols in hostile territory. But this mission wasn't about engaging the enemy. It was about supporting a brother who'd given everything for his country and asked for nothing in return. Mike made the first call to Jenkins, who immediately agreed to help. Jenkins then contacted other veterans in the Phoenix area, some from Vietnam, others from later conflicts, all united by the understanding that Marines never leave a fellow Marine behind. Within 2 days, a plan was in motion. The following Saturday morning, William Chen was enjoying his coffee and reviewing his weekly yard maintenance schedule when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside. Through his kitchen window, he watched in confusion as a convoy of pickup trucks, each loaded with professional landscaping equipment, parked along Maple Street. From the trucks emerged not the typical landscaping crew Chen expected, but a group of older men, most wearing military caps or veteran-themed clothing. They moved with purpose and organization, unloading equipment with the efficiency of a well-trained unit. At their head was a man in his 70s who walked with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Master Sergeant Mike Johnson had driven up from Tucson that morning, bringing with him a sense of mission that had nothing to do with grass cutting and everything to do with honor. He approached Tommy's house and knocked on the door with the confidence of someone delivering good news. Tommy opened the door to find his old squad leader standing on his porch, grinning with the same expression he'd worn 40 years ago when announcing that their tour was over and they were going home. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Mike said with mock formality, "by order of the unofficial Veterans Garden Brigade, your yard is now under new management." Behind Mike, Tommy could see a dozen veterans of various ages setting up equipment, measuring his yard, and beginning what was clearly a professional landscaping operation. Jenkins approached with a clipboard, introducing himself and explaining that this was a volunteer operation funded by the local VFW post and executed by veterans who understood that sometimes brotherhood meant more than shared memory. Across the street, William Chen watched in growing confusion as his neighbor's yard was transformed by what appeared to be a military operation disguised as lawn care. The men worked with remarkable efficiency, some operating commercial-grade mowers while others planted new shrubs and repaired the irrigation system. Their coordination suggested this wasn't their first such operation. By noon, Chen's curiosity had overcome his usual reluctance to involve himself in other people's business. He crossed the street, approaching the work site with the intention of finding out what was happening and perhaps complaining about the noise and disruption. "Excuse me," he called to the man who seemed to be in charge. "What's going on here? This is a residential neighborhood, not a construction zone." Jenkins looked up from the flower bed he was preparing, his hands dirty but his manner professional. "Volunteer community service," he said simply. "Helping out a neighbor. Community service?" Chen frowned. "Who authorized this? Did the HOA approve this kind of commercial activity?" "Commercial," Jenkins laughed, but not unkindly. "Sir, this is a group of veterans helping out one of our own. No money changing hands, no permits required, just neighbors helping neighbors." Chen's frown deepened. "Veterans? What does that have to do with yard maintenance?" It was Mike Johnson who answered, approaching from where he'd been supervising the installation of a new sprinkler system. "It has everything to do with it. You see, Tommy Rodriguez over there isn't just your neighbor. He's a decorated Marine who lost both his legs serving this country in Vietnam." The words hit Chen like cold water. He glanced toward the porch where Tommy sat watching the operation, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. I didn't know," Chen stammered. "No," Mike said, his voice carrying decades of authority. "You didn't. You saw an old man with an unkempt yard and decided he was lazy or irresponsible. You never bothered to learn that he's been fighting a different kind of battle for 40 years. Mike pulled out his phone and showed Chen a photograph, a group of young Marines in jungle fatigues, Tommy clearly visible among them, whole and strong and ready to face whatever the war threw at them. This picture was taken 2 weeks before Tommy stepped on a landmine while carrying wounded Marines to safety, Mike continued. He saved 4 lives that day and lost both his legs doing it. The shrapnel from that explosion is still in his spine. He's had 37 surgeries trying to deal with complications from those injuries. Chen stared at the photograph, then at Tommy, then back at the veterans who were transforming the yard with military precision. I had no idea, he whispered. Of course you didn't, said another voice. Chen turned to see an older woman approaching from down the street. It was Mrs. Patterson, the 82-year-old he'd held up as an example of proper senior citizen yard maintenance. Margaret, you knew about this? Chen asked his neighbor. I've known Tommy for 15 years, Miss Patterson replied, her voice carrying a calm edge of disappointment. Ever since my Harold died, Tommy has been the one checking on me, making sure I'm okay after storms, helping with things I can't manage alone, all while dealing with pain you and I can't imagine. Chin felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, his certainty about right and wrong crumbling as he learned information that changed everything. But why didn't he say something? Chin asked. When I complained about the yard, why didn't he explain? It was Tommy himself who answered, having wheeled his chair close enough to join the conversation. Because I shouldn't have to prove my worth to live in my own neighborhood, he said quietly. Because my service record isn't an excuse for things I can't control. It's just part of who I am. The work continued around them, but the focus had shifted from landscaping to education. One by one, the veteran volunteers shared their own stories. Jenkins and his post office career after recovering from his Vietnam wounds. Rodriguez, a different Rodriguez. No relation to Tommy and his struggle with PTSD after 3 tours in Iraq. Williams and his transition from Army medic to civilian paramedic. Each story was a reminder that veterans didn't stop serving when they took off the uniform. They continued contributing to their communities in ways that often went unrecognized. And each story highlighted the challenges that came with carrying invisible wounds in a society that expected everyone to maintain the same standards, regardless of the price they'd paid for the freedom to have those standards. By late afternoon, Tommy's yard had been transformed. The grass was evenly cut and edged. New drought-resistant plants had been installed in carefully planned beds, and a small automatic irrigation system ensured that maintenance would be manageable going forward. But more than the landscaping had changed. William Chen stood in his own pristine yard that evening, looking across the street at his neighbor's now perfect lawn, but seeing it completely differently than he had that morning. The precision of the landscaping was impressive, but what struck him most was the small American flag that had always been there, now properly illuminated by a new solar spotlight that the veterans had installed. The next morning, Chen walked across the street and knocked on Tommy's door. When the old Marine answered, Chen was holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing an expression of genuine remorse. "Tommy," he said, using his neighbor's first name for the first time in years, "I owe you an apology. A big one." Tommy invited him in, and over coffee, Chen listened to stories he should have heard years ago. Stories about growing up in East LA, about enlisting in the Marines to serve his country, about the friends who didn't come home from Vietnam, about the decades of struggle to build a normal life with artificial legs and constant pain. In return, Chen shared his own story, his fear of retirement, his need to control his environment because so much of life felt uncertain, his realization that he'd been measuring worth by the wrong standards. "I want to help," Chen said finally. "With the yard, with whatever you need. I should have been a better neighbor." Tommy smiled, the first genuine smile Chen had ever seen from him. "You're being a better neighbor right now. That's what matters." Over the following weeks, Maple Street began to change in ways that had nothing to do with landscape. Chen organized a neighborhood barbecue where Tommy was the guest of honor, giving residents a chance to learn about the veteran they'd overlooked for years. Mrs. Patterson started a weekly coffee gathering where neighbors actually talked to each other instead of just enforcing HOA regulation. The local newspaper picked up the story, not as a feel-good piece about yard work, but as an examination of how communities can better support their veteran residents. The article led to policy changes in the HOA, creating hardship exceptions for residents dealing with service-connected disabilities. Most importantly, Tommy Rodriguez was no longer invisible on Maple Street. His neighbors learned to see past the wheelchair and the prosthetics to the man who'd sacrificed everything for strangers and never once complained about the price he'd paid. The veterans who'd transformed Tommy's yard that Saturday remained connected to him, creating an informal support network that ensured he'd never again face challenges alone. They met monthly for coffee, shared resources and assistance, and reminded each other that service to country was a lifetime commitment that didn't end with discharge papers. 6 months later, William Chen received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs thanking him for his nomination of Tommy Rodriguez for the Outstanding Community Veteran Award. Chen had written a detailed letter describing Tommy's quiet service to neighbors, his dignity in the face of challenges, and his example of grace under pressure. At the award ceremony, Chen sat in the front row as Tommy was honored not just for his military service, but for his continued contribution to his community. The citation read, "In part, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez exemplifies the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment, serving as an inspiration to neighbors and fellow veterans alike." In his acceptance speech, Tommy thanked the veterans who'd rallied to his aid, but he also thanked William Chen for teaching him an important lesson about the power of communication and the possibility of redemption. Sometimes, Tommy said, his voice carrying clearly through the VFW hall, we all need to be reminded that we're fighting on the same side. My neighbor and I learned that it's never too late to start over, to choose understanding over judgment, to build bridges instead of walls. The story of Maple Street became a model for other communities, showing how assumptions about weakness or laziness often mask hidden struggles and sacrifice. It demonstrated that true neighborhood pride comes not from perfect lawns, but from perfect compassion, from taking the time to know the people around us before judging their circumstance. Tommy Rodriguez continued living at 2047 Maple Street, but he was no longer the old man with the messy yard. He was the veteran who'd taught his neighborhood about sacrifice, the neighbor who'd shown them the difference between standards and compassion, and the Marine who'd proved that honor isn't diminished by hardship, it's refined by it. And every morning, when William Chen stepped outside to tend his still perfect lawn, he paused to wave at the man across the street who'd taught him that the most beautiful gardens are those tended by understanding, watered with respect, and grown in soil enriched by the stories we take time to hear. Because real neighborhood pride isn't about maintaining property values, it's about maintaining our values as neighbors, as Americans, and as human beings who recognize that everyone carries burdens we can't see, and everyone deserves the chance to be known for more than their worst day.